listening to the Astral Hour. I'm your host, Astral Meadow. Join me as we take a glimpse into the mysterious. Welcome, everyone. Today I'm joined with my husband, Justin. You might remember him from our introduction episode. We're going to talk about shadow work and some things that we've learned on our journey with it. Taking the time to better understand our shadows has been huge for us individually and as a couple. It takes time, and I wouldn't call it easy, but the impact of doing this work is life-changing. And if you are not working on it consciously, you're still unconsciously projecting it. That's kind of an intense intro. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Thanks for doing this with me.
Absolutely. I'm excited to be on here and be a part of it. I did the intro way back when. It's been a year now, at least.
Right.
Which is awesome. Congratulations on doing that for a year. That's really cool.
Yeah. It's interesting how I've had this episode in my mind for about a year now, because it was one of the first things that came to me when I thought about doing a podcast.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
But I was like, I don't know. How do I go about doing that properly? But then when I had the episode with Noah, when he was looking at my black moon Lilith, and how it's like on my Pluto and how it's right there like with my midheaven, and when he said your chart gives you permission to do this shadow work, for all of us, like to share it with all of us, right?
That's interesting too.
And when he said that, I was like, okay, so now the thing that I dreamed, that I kind of had this feeling was going to come up, now was just like almost invited through my chart.
Right.
It was like, you kind of need to do this for everyone. Like, this is something that you would be good at talking about. So we'll see how it goes.
I think, as the more that I've learned about it and read about it with you, I understand how critically important that this is. And so you can learn about all this other fascinating stuff. But if you don't do this particular crucial part of, your life here as a human, then you miss so much, and it's almost all the rest of it becomes irrelevant because you're being controlled, by the unconscious.
Right. So let's take a moment to talk about what the shadow is and give a little background on it and where it comes from and how it manifests and all that. And I'm going to start reading directly from Jung and his explanation of it. So let's go straight to the source here.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the things that we hear about the shadow are just further interpretations of Jung's work.
Before we get started, I want to interject and just say that, for many, many years, I've always been fascinated in the mysterious things of the world, and especially mysterious histories and Atlantis and ghosts and aliens and all the various things out there that we don't really understand. And it's really blown my mind in the past couple of years that as I've really dug into it and tried to really learn stuff, it is absolutely amazing how integral and how connected Jung is to all of it. It's like you almost can't read into like dimensions and all of this stuff without Jung coming up. And I would have never, ever thought that. I would have never, ever guessed that. But it just seemed like the psychology and the mysteries of the world were separate. But that's so naive. But it really is exciting, like as I learn more, and then you read about all these various stuff, and they'll use Jung quotes in there, and you're like, oh my God, okay.
I almost laugh at this point because there's like never if I open any spiritual book, I tend to always open it to a Jung quote or someone's talking about Goethe's Faust.
Yeah.
And it's just wild to me. It's like, it's so relevant right now. And I think that it's just right there for us to sort of grasp. Like, it's finally ready for like modern man, the archetype of modern man. We're finally ready for what these people had to say. And it's interesting because Faust is so much of a story about the ego and the shadow, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Yes.
Because Jung comes up through all of this, and he's such an important part. So it's just super important that you have a base understanding of what in the world he's getting at, which is why this is so exciting. So anyway.
Yes. Okay. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. For no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge, and it therefore, as a rule, meets with considerable resistance. Indeed, self-knowledge as a psychotherapeutic measure frequently requires much painstaking work extending over a long period. Closer examination of the dark characteristics, that is, the inferiorities constituting the shadow, reveals that they have an emotional nature, a kind of autonomy, and accordingly an obsessive, or better, possessive quality. All right, so if I were to take this and create my own definition out of it, what is the shadow to me? It's the darker side of me. It's the, like the yin and the yang. It's the, it's what's going to bring me into balance. It's also very tied in to the ego. I mean, they mirror each other.
Right.
So we've got the ego on the surface, the conscious aspect, and then the shadow is mirroring the ego in the unconscious. So everything that I do, that sort of feeds that ego is also on another end of the spectrum feeding into the shadow as well. So because they work together.
Right.
But because one is unconscious, we don't give it any attention or recognition in our conscious life. And so then now it becomes this entity that is starved for attention, if that makes sense. And so it comes out into our conscious reality through projections.
Right. I think in a lot of ways, most people try to avoid it even still.
Right. Why wouldn't you?
Right. Anytime that it comes up, I think people just shy away from it immediately, and they think, "Oh, that's not me. I wouldn't hurt a fly. I'm not a mean person or a jealous person, or I would never hurt anybody." And anytime that they become face to face with that about themselves, they think of anything that they can to say that's not true. And that goes into the video that we were watching with what was his name? Robert Johnson. And he was saying that that one of the last things that anybody ever does is admit the
best parts.
The best parts of themselves. And that includes going through the darkness and stuff.
Right. So it's almost easier for them to acknowledge the shadow as like a dark aspect, but it's harder for them to recognize that there's any value or any gold within the shadow. That's the last thing before I feel like integration.
Right.
And
so that keeps them denying it, because if they don't ever see any positive in it, they're like, no, I'm not a liar. I don't do that. I don't do that.
Right. So I meant to bring this up too, and talking about where the shadow comes from. Well, it comes over time. Well, it's not like it comes from here, but it's an aspect of what helps mold it is our culture. So as we're growing, we are learning the ways of society so that we can fit in and, exist in our culture. And so this is sort of the separation of we have personal shadows, we have collective shadows. So our culture, our shadows a little bit different. In America, you got to keep your shoes on to go into a building, or they think, get out of here, you girl, like put your
Right.
shoes on. But then in a different culture, they're like, "Ugh, get out of here with your shoes on, keep that
Right.
filth outside." And so these are little ways that the different societies in the world might have kind of different attributes within their shadows, is because the culture is different. So what's deemed bad here might be good there, but every time we're told that something is bad or shameful or not accepted or gross, I mean, where does that go? It gets stored into the shadow.
Right.
So over time, I mean, it's just like if you think about having a closet and you're just shoving.
Right.
I mean, we all did that as kids, right? Like you fill up like your toy box or under your bed or whatever, and you're just filling it up with stuff because you don't want to clean it.
I think a good example of this is like a people pleaser, for this particular example, because or somebody who doesn't want to stir the pot or cause trouble. You show up at a party and you walk in the room and somebody's like, "Hey, there's dummy over there," and like just makes it a joke, and like you don't want to cause a fight in front of everybody, and so you just let it go and you repress it. But it irks at you. Whereas your shadow side would have jumped right out and snapped back and like protected you or said something else in that regard. And if you never say anything, then you go home later and you have that resentment that builds up inside of you. And then the more you do that, the more it builds and builds and builds until one day somebody says something to you and you literally snap. And maybe you do something really bad that day. And it's all because you haven't been letting your shadow out on all these points, and it's built up, and finally it's going to explode.
Right.
And something's going to come out. And that goes to the analogy that I thought was fantastic with learning about the shadow was the teeter-totter. And so that we have this light side and the dark side, and you can think of it as like setting it out on a teeter-totter. And on the right side, of course, those are all the right things that we do. And the left side,
The saintly things.
right. And the left side is all the wrong things, the things that we think we shouldn't do. And as you become civilized, as you grow up, you assign things to each side and you pile them on. And you can take this analogy all the way down, and so that when things become too much, it literally snaps. Like
Right.
on one side or the other, it's too heavy, and you have a breakdown. Your teeter-totter breaks.
Right. You actually say that guy lost it.
Yeah, like he broke down.
He broke down.
Yeah, and so that's because you've got too much on either side, and the darkness hasn't had a chance to come out, and at some point it will, and that's just the nature of the universe is the yin and yang. For every action on the light side, you will have an equal reaction on the dark side, and if you're never expressing it, then someday that's going to come out, and it's going to it's real unconscious, and you're not going to know, and it could get really bad.
Right. And this all comes back to the principle of polarity,
Right.
and this is just the realm that we live in, this is one of the laws here. And if you don't know the rules of the game, then are you even really playing, or are you being like almost a victim of your shadow?
Right.
So I wanted to go back because we talked about the teeter-totter, and we have brought up Robert Johnson earlier, but I just wanted to kind of introduce him a little bit more and let people know that that's where that analogy came from.
Yes.
So Robert Johnson is a psychoanalyst. Am I saying that right?
I think so.
He's a writer. He was a writer. He passed away now. But he worked with Carl Jung. So Carl Jung was towards the end of his life when Robert was just sort of beginning, and he worked with him directly and got advice from him and worked closely with his wife, and took all the things that Jung taught him very literally, right? And created these beautiful rituals. And the teeter-totter is just one of his examples or tools for working with the shadow, and it's so beautiful, right? Because you recognize that it's a balancing act and that it's in constant motion. So there is no white and black. It's like constantly blending the grays. And if you listen to him speak, which I'm gonna at the end. I will put a link for his video
Mm-hmm.
on, I think it's called Your Shadow, and it's him talking. But I'll also, he wrote a really great book on owning your
Yeah,
shadow.
owning your shadow.
And so I'll also put that in the comments. So this is so good. He did such a good job with this. But he makes this sort of joke about, like, in India, they know this too. They've got like the Shiva Shakti, the destruction and the rebirth. And in their culture, all this is in there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have it too. But it's like the symbolic language that it's so symbolic that people don't realize that there is sort of a literal aspect to it,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So we do have it a little bit within some of the Christian mythology too, if you know where to look. But in like Indian mythology, it's more kind of known.
Mm-hmm.
And they sort of have this joke of like, once you finally find the balance, right? And you're no longer playing the game, you'll die in 3 days.
Yeah.
And he kind of laughs about it, but that's, we incarnate here with this purpose.
Right.
And it's a game, and it's a juggling act, and there's a lot going on. And then once we, complete that, what's the point, right? And so
It feels much more like that would be the answer to a, like, what's the meaning of life question, as opposed
Right.
to learn how to love. It's more to learn how to balance and find the moderation in the middle of all things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because that's how you would balance your teeter-totter, is to be there in the middle at the fulcrum.
Right.
And, equal parts good and bad. But at that point, you're not being bad. You're just, it's kind of hard to describe in that way.
Mm-hmm.
You're using that energy, that potential energy, to move forward.
Okay, so you bring up an interesting thing. William Blake talks about how we go to heaven for form, but we go to hell for energy. So let's talk a little bit more about that energy. So when we think about form, which would be like the right side
Mm-hmm.
of the teeter-totter, this is form, this is structure, this is where intelligence comes from. But on the other side, this is where we go to get our energy. So if we're only existing on one side, not only are we completely imbalanced, but we are missing this latent energy that's just within us, that it's like we don't even realize the source. So you were telling the story earlier that he used, and I'll let you tell it again, about where he was very tired before a lecture.
Yeah. I thought that was an interesting little story he gave. So early on, he was talking to some lady, and he'd been giving a lot of speeches around the country and stuff. And he was exhausted and he just didn't have the energy to go give an 1.5-hour speech. And he was kind of complaining, and the lady said, "Okay, well, go do this. So go to find you a private room and get you a towel, and take that towel and
wet it.
Get it wet. Yeah, you want it to be heavier, but not so heavy that you can't move it. But get it wet so that you can have it. And then I want you to hit the ground as hard as you can. I want you to just sling it. And I want you to do that about 15 times. And if you want to, you can yell too at the same time." And he thought that was just nuts. And he was like, "Okay, I'll go do it." And sure enough, he went and did that. And he said when he left that room to go out on the stage, there was fire in his eyes. And he was energized, and he had used that energy. And, you start slinging that towel, and it starts bringing out this energy that's inside of you. Maybe it brings up frustration from earlier in the day, or resentment, or maybe he started thinking about what his critics say about him or something. And he started slinging that towel, and that energy that he got as he did that fueled him. And he was able to come back out onto the stage and give an amazing speech. Mm-hmm. And that's that energy that's inside the shadow that we don't ever tap into.
Right. And this leads me to talk about how we can tap into the shadow through ritual, and we can use like the language of symbolism to sort of communicate with it, and that this is a way for us to communicate, So what did he do? What was that? That was a ritual that he came up with. And so at that point, when you're yelling and you're banging and you're really tuning into like almost a primitive aspect of yourself. You know, you think of like our ancestors around the fire with the beating the drums and doing the chants and just really being alive and present in their bodies. And I think all of our ancestors had these different rituals where they were working on the shadow, whether that was collectively their collective shadow, you know, but in some way, as they were doing it, they had to be working on the personal as well.
Right.
You know, and so for me, you know, when I think about it, like ecstatic dance for me is kind of a little bit of shadow work. I guess we'll talk about some different ways to work with the shadow, but you know, as I'm there, and it's funny because Charity, who runs it, she always says egos don't dance. And that's so true, you know. And the first few dances I went to, I was a little bit more concerned. You know, my ego was still very present. And it's not like we're ever fully transcending the ego, right? We're just trying to merge them. But the ego was at this level holding me back.
Right.
Okay, from this access.
It thinks it's trying to protect you.
Right.
But it's not. It's
right.
keeping
In some
you
ways it does, but in some ways you have to consciously be like, okay, I hear you, ego, but this is more important. So
that would be, just to go off the metaphor, that would be sliding inward on the teeter-totter.
Right.
Not giving the ego as much room.
Right. And allowing the shadow some.
Right. Scoot towards the middle.
Space, some consciousness. So by the time I got to like my third or fourth ecstatic dance, I had, to some extent, I don't want to say I've like totally moved past to where I don't ever stop at any point in the dance and be like, okay, that might look weird. But it doesn't prevent me from doing it.
Right.
So if I want to make a weird animal sound and like stomp and like whatever it is, you know, bang my arms on the ground, that is my, you know, I'm giving the ego a little less energy and allowing my more primitive side, which is, you know, the shadow does feel a little bit more primitive,
right?
Like a more primitive energy. And then I dance, right? And I'm dancing in between this. And then at some point it's like, I'm just spirit, you know, and I'm kind of beyond like the shadow or the ego in that way. And I'm not saying I fully transcended it, because after the dance is over, I'm back in my body and, you know, I'm doing the game again.
Right.
But there's this moment, and it's almost every time, where I hit this golden point. And I think that's what they're talking about with the gold and the shadow. Like when you lay off the ego a little bit and allow that shadow to come into the dance, you know, there's a magic there. There's like an alchemy there. And this last dance I went to, it was about a week ago, I went into it with the intention of, this is a ritual. You know, I like braided my hair a certain way. I put like feathers in my hair. I drew like sigils, you know, on my face before I put my makeup on.
Yeah.
And, you know, I did some mantras, and, you know, I wore like an outfit that I would consider more of a ritual. It felt like a tribal kind of outfit. And so when I went in as this, like I was seeking something, you know, I wasn't sure what it was. It was to release, to merge, to bring up, to clear. It was like there was so much going on within the dance, and the different speeds of the dance. It was like the intention would kind of shift, and then at some point I lost all control, and so all my intentions sort of fade, and then I'm just in the flow state at that point. Right. So I've set it up to where I can participate in that ritual, but at some point the ritual actually becomes a little less important, and the actual act is something else. You know, it's something beyond what I could intend.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so.
So, so that for me, ecstatic dance is a way that I work with my shadow. It's one of the ways. You know, it's hard to make something unconscious conscious.
Yeah.
Like it seems a little like, what? You know, like you.
Well, it transforms because it becomes conscious at that point. And
Right.
so it's not unconscious. That that was one of the questions on that Robert Johnson video. Somebody asked him at the end, they included it. It says, if isn't working on this, doesn't it make it conscious and then it kind of negates it at that point? And it's like, well, by definition, perhaps, but ultimately that's integrating it. You're becoming aware of it, and then you can balance it at that point. And it's never going to keep it from happening, but like, if somebody cuts you off in traffic, you may burst immediately, and then you're like, oh goodness, that was my shit, or that was anger, I need to redirect that or something. And you're able to fix things quicker and become more aware. And sometimes it even keeps it from happening.
Right.
If your kids are frustrating you, you can, think about it for a minute and be like, why is this frustrating me? Because I'm being impatient. I want this to go a certain way, and they're not making it happen. And so as you do it more, it becomes a little easier to think about. And, I'm still working on the whole energy aspect of it. It's super fascinating to me that you could take that energy and focus it into something productive. Mm-hmm. For instance, I was listening to Jordan Peterson talk about the shadow. He's a psychologist and professor that I really like. And he was saying that before he gives his speeches, he uses the critique of the people who've given him negative reviews and stuff to kind of power him. And he goes out and he's able to give a real impassioned speech because of that. And sometimes people critique him and say that he's an angry man. And he said, but I'm not angry at all. I'm using that shadow.
And that's his ritual.
Right, exactly. And so, I think those are good examples of how you can use this energy that appears in you and push it forward so that it's actually benefiting you and not hindering you. Because it's there. And one way or another, it's going to affect you. And me personally, I don't really like the idea of these unseen forces just controlling my life, whipping me around in the surf. I'd rather stand up and try to direct myself properly through the water, as opposed to something just whipping me around. And I think I'm doing good until a wave crashes through and I explode all over my family or something, and everybody's like, "Oh my God, where did that come from?"
Right.
'Cause I don't want to be that way. So it's quite exciting. And the rituals are definitely a powerful thing with that.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the rituals. So, yes, ecstatic dance. They also have some really cool shadow work journals. And I'm telling you, there are so many options out there. So I found this one that I really liked. And it was based around like 30 days of shadow work. And 30 was important because it takes a little bit to kind of rewire your brain. And once you start doing shadow work, you think, oh, I did my shadow work. It's never done.
Right.
So doing it every day for 30 days consciously sort of helps rewire you to think of life that way. And as I was doing it, I was like, oh, I'm already doing a lot of this. But I wasn't necessarily consciously doing it. So the journal was really great to keep me like focused and maybe even go to the parts of the shadow that I don't necessarily like. So I might be more aware of like jealousy, but then there was other parts that it was bringing out. And I was like, oh, and so without the prompts, I might have not went there all on my own, like, cause it is unconscious. So the prompts are there to help bring it out, and then you have to meditate on it, and then you respond. So you write in your journal, and then it goes over some really cool.
Is it set up to be done as a couple, or did we just do it that way?
We just did it that way. And, shadow work is personal. So it's really just about you. But there was something about it that I felt like was needed for us, particularly as a couple. Mm-hmm. But I think if everyone's individually doing the shadow work, that you don't necessarily have to do it as a couple. But I think just like there's a collective shadow, there's also a shadow over couples, families, churches, communities, cities, and then it gets bigger and bigger. But like for us, we had our own shadow attributes within just our relationship. And as we were doing the shadow work together, so I'd done a lot of EMDR and done shadow work with myself and went to therapy. And therapy is shadow work. Okay.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
if you're afraid, if you've been, really messed up from like birth, like my situation, I needed a therapist to help me initiate it and to work through some of the really rough stuff.
Right.
But, as I worked with her, I slowly started feeling confident that I could actually do some of this work on my own, and then she's still available to me. So if I hit something that's really bad, I would be able to call my therapist or a healer. I have different rituals. So like when I was doing EMDR, I might go and get acupuncture done afterwards, because that was sort of moving it around out of the aura and stuff like that. So I realized that when I was doing shadow work, I was creating my own rituals, and I didn't know to label it as that until later on. But yeah, therapy is shadow work. So yeah, keeping the journals and meditations, dream analysis. So our dreams, for the most part, are our unconscious parts of ourselves communicating with us symbolically. And so keeping a journal by the bed, waking up, writing it down, even the dreams that don't seem to have much content, just write it down and think about it, give it some space.
Yeah.
We just hurry, we got our alarms and we just rush into our day, and we miss the magic of like that first deep breath, before we put our feet on the floor. There's some magic in that space that I think, we need to slow down a little bit and think, what did I dream last night? What came up unconsciously? What am I supposed to recognize, maybe today, or some pattern that comes out? I mean, dreams are such a wonderful way to tap into this content,
Right.
And
yeah,
so,
I don't do a good job with that the way that I would like to. I feel like I get up and immediately start moving, and dreams they fade quickly. Yeah. I've never been able to successfully implement a dream journal the way that I should.
Yeah, it's it has to be your intention.
Right.
Stuff like this, so like the journaling, it's not that part of it's hard, but you have to set the intention. So this is why like doing 30 days is really cool. And like with Kundalini yoga, you do like 40-day kriyas. And it's because it takes 40 days for the brain to sort of click over into like this, to create this new pathway that doesn't exist. And we do this like through repetition, through intention, and stuff like that, and just giving it space. So dream analysis is another way to work with the shadow. Studying your projections, probably a big way. There's so much magic in studying your projections. I mean, that is untapped energy right there.
So what exactly does that mean, studying your projections?
Okay, so I'm going to give you an example.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to start with projections. If you just think about like a projector projecting an image on a screen.
Sure.
Are not based in reality.
Right.
Okay. They are images, but they don't necessarily have any ground.
Right.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about jealousy. And I'm going to, as a little girl in this culture, I grew up and I was definitely not rich. I didn't have all the things or the means to make myself pretty. I didn't have all of the cool clothes, and I didn't have all the same things. And so this kind of set me up to have to work with the energy of jealousy in like a very obvious way where some people might not realize, oh, I'm not jealous. But there was a point where I recognized it.
Yeah.
And I was pretty devout Christian when I was a kid. So I did, like work on like deadly sins and stuff. So I was working on my jealousy and how like projecting that onto these beautiful women or beautiful girls, like, but almost not even being, when you're jealous, okay, that's on you. So why was I jealous? Because I wasn't being provided for. I didn't have all these things. And so I was projecting that onto other people. And this was preventing me from having friendships. I mean, there's no telling what roads would have shifted had I not reacted in jealousy with people, had I embraced them. And so in this way, the projection was preventing me from seeing beauty in other people. Because I was like, well, I would be beautiful too if I had everything.
Right.
But realizing that all that was so superficial, you know, and at the end of the day, they're just a person, you know, and we're all going to get old and wrinkly, and all of the prettiness that is artificial will fade. And so, but working through jealousy has helped me embrace women and more, and to truly honor the divine feminine. And I couldn't do that if I still was operating and projecting that jealousy on, because I would never fully be able to see the beauty of the woman in front of me outside of the superficial projections.
Right.
So that's just a way that our projections can sneak in, and it creates, I mean, it's totally false. Like, you see a pretty woman and they got their nails done and their hair. And this was something too, because my mother was so, you know, about the tomboy and not embracing feminine. So I was kind of raised around someone else projecting that onto me.
Right.
To where I'm like, I really don't want to be like that, you know, like a dumb blonde. You know, this is a stereotype, right? And because I was raised with someone that really hated that, you know, it was showed up in me of like, you know, is there nothing more to these people?
Right.
You know, and the thing is that there is, but we are only seeing someone's persona.
Right.
We only see what people allow us to see, and that there's no one on this planet that, you know, is at the surface level of what we see. Everybody has depth. Everyone has shadow. Everyone has emotions and things to say, and, you know, and maybe they've disconnected because they become so identified with the persona that maybe a part of them, you know, doesn't even remember some of the depth to them, but it's there.
I would say it's
know?
even harder these days because, you know, simply we have social media and all of these things that put your persona on display more than it ever was.
Right.
And so it's really important that you don't portray yourself in the world as this way or that way. You know, you want it to be a certain way, and that's your ego and your persona trying to keep you in check.
Right. So think about it. So another way to do shadow work is to feel into your body. So think about when you're scrolling social media, think about the posts that you will not heart. You will not like, you will not give that, like, so you see a picture of a beautiful girl and she's feeling herself and she's taking a selfie, and you see it and you think to yourself, oh God, here we go with the vanity again, or whatever, you know. And this, I feel like it's a thing. I see people like hating on girls for posting selfies, and now I can pull myself back and say, well, that's just their shadow projecting, right? That you know, they're refusing to acknowledge that post. They won't like it. They, you know, it repulses them.
Right.
And so studying things that repulse you, or anytime you judge a person, or you roll your eyes at a person, or you just feel like, ugh, you know, and those feelings are flags. Okay. So someone annoys me, and then that flag goes up, and then now I have an opportunity to ask myself, why am I so annoyed?
Right.
And I can almost always find something in myself that actually has nothing to do with the person in front of me. And when I can work on that, I can meet that person where they are. I remove the projection, which is false. Right. It's a false reality. I remove that, and now I can actually love and embrace the person in front of me. Why? Because I've also learned how to love and embrace that aspect of myself. So I'm not judging them anymore about it, because I'm like, oh, well, I have those abilities or that quality in myself.
So using from the video that we watched with Robert Johnson, and he gave an example about a beach bum, because at one time he was a very well put together, proper.
All the time.
Well, all the time. Well, I don't know. He by the end of it, he got closer together, and I feel like that he said he brought the lightness and the fun to Mr. Whoever, and I think. So what that is he saw his shadow aspect as this beach bum that was down there, that was living there, that wasn't doing anything and all of that.
Right. When he see the beach bums, he would almost judge them in that way.
Right. And so I just had the thought, I guess what that's saying is that you're actually maybe judging yourself for not being more laid back.
Right. And you recognize.
And you're like, look at him over there. He needs to get a job and do all this. And that's because you're putting so much of yourself onto that belief
That you actually dislike the people that aren't doing
that are getting
it.
away with what you think they shouldn't, because you think they shouldn't be able to get away with that. I work hard and I'm able to do this.
Right.
And they should have to do that too. And really what that means is you wish that you could work less and get away with it and do that. And like,
Right. Or there wouldn't be bitterness. Period.
right, exactly. That's
So
that's
if
the
there's
reason.
any bitterness, that's a flag.
Right. And it's showing you a shadow aspect.
So if you pass a homeless person on the sidewalk and you feel grossed out by them, that's a flag. That's a feeling. And you would ask yourself, what is it about myself, that I'm rejecting that makes me not see the true light of that person that's sitting there? That's actually might be suffering.
Right.
That you might actually be able to help by smiling at, but because you're repulsed, you frown at them.
Right. You're like, get away from me.
But could you imagine being that person that all day everyone looks at you like you're gross and no one smiles at you? So it's not even that maybe they need money, maybe you don't have the money to give, but maybe you could look them in the eye, greet them, and say, Satnam.
Right.
Or whatever,
Yeah.
And so we can see over and over again
Right.
these projections, and how it's really us, right? Like for him, his shadow is a beach bum. That beach bum lived within him.
Right.
And it tested him, like, why don't you quit your job and just live on the beach?
Right. And not do anything.
Right. Why don't you just be lazy?
Right. Yeah. Give
So
up all of your stuff.
Another really great way to work with, to do shadow work, is to study astrology. And this was so good for me in a deeper way. And as I was learning astrology, I wasn't even really thinking about it as like how important it was. Especially so astrology is like, if you're looking at your natal chart, you're studying yourself, but the collective unconscious communicates with us through archetypes. So you cannot possibly study your natal chart and not learn more about everyone in your life and the collective as a whole, because all of these archetypes are actually within every person. And so as I was studying it, every single zodiac sign has positive, or in shadow attributes. And so it was actually so healthy for me to look at those shadow sides of myself, so I have a Capricorn stellium. I'm really driven, but this can make me overly ambitious. This can lead me to, just work myself to death. I mean, and then in that aspect, that's a negative. So when he looked at himself as like, he was so proud of how hard he could work that he was judging the beach bum.
Right.
Well, this is kind of a Capricorn energy of like, you value hard work so much, and what's the other aspect of that is that you might judge people, right, that aren't, working hard. So yeah, astrology was so good in that way, is that it really helps you get familiar with the archetypes.
Right.
And so Jung had certain archetypes that he focused on a lot. And let's see, I'm going to pull my shadow workbook out for this because I did write them down, but I kind of liked in this book. So the archetype would be at the top. So for this, it would be the lover. And then it's like a triangle. And so the bottom 2 points, would be the obsessive lover or like the impotent lover. Okay. So those are things that you could focus on. And we all have that quality within us. And certain archetypes, I think, are more important for some people. Like there's some energies, and I don't want to say I've mastered them, but I feel as though they're a little less frequent in my life.
Right.
So some, like when I go to the king here, which is next, the main archetype would be the king, and then the shadow is the tyrant,
Right.
and the weakling. And
these are the extremes of each side.
Of the shadow, yeah.
Because if you balanced the way, then you would be a good king. You would be just.
So there's potential.
Right. And so if you choose not to do that, if you let your shadow overrun you, then you could become a tyrant,
Right. So this was interesting with the king, because I think, oh, king's masculine. I don't really relate to the king. But then I went back and reflected on the king, and the aspect where it's like the weakling was a past life I had that I learned through Akashic Records, where I was Philip III, who was like the king of Spain. And he wasn't a good king. He wasn't an evil king,
Right.
but he gave his power away so that he could just kind of live life,
Yeah.
make a bunch of babies, party hard, and kind of threw his country under the bus. So even though I was like, I'm not the king. You think, oh, I don't have this archetype. I was like, how weird and deep does it go? I mean, how many lifetimes? Like, so maybe you don't have that right now, but I mean, at some point you probably have
Right.
actually embodied that in a past life. But we also work with these archetypes with others. So like my son, has a Leo stellium. So, I mean, it's such a big, and his son,
Right.
he's a Leo sun with his Venus and Mercury. I mean, he thinks like a Leo. He loves like a Leo. He shines like a Leo. But Leo is king. And so it's funny because with the king, it really, I look at Emerson sometimes as like he'll just start bossing some people around. And I'm just like, buddy, like you want to be a good king.
Right.
You want to consider everyone's feelings and it's okay to lead. It is.
Right.
But you have to consider everyone in the room, that you're leading, because that would make you a bad king, right? If you were just bossing people around and not asking them, like, do you want to play this game with me?
Right.
Like, are you actually, desiring this, or am I pushing you?
Right. Yeah. Making you do it.
Right. Because people don't want to be around, someone that's bossy or that's telling them, you have to act this way. Right. So I'll let you come up with that. What are some of your archetypes that stand out?
Well, I don't, that's hard to say
Well,
on the spot, but this list I thought was really, really good. And I feel like it helps you kind of understand the way that they work. Because at the top, you get the shadow ruler is also known as the tyrant. It's the archetype that takes control to the extreme.
Right.
They're repressive, dictatorial, oppressive. You got the anarchist, which is the shadow version of the rebel.
That's very Aquarian.
And they take rebellion to the extreme. They're
Yes.
disruptive, chaotic, destructive. And they just, it's all of this is the extreme when you don't have it balanced.
Right. So here's some shadow work that I've done recently. Okay. I have Aquarius stellium, and it's in the first house. So it's all about me. Okay. So I have to consider Aquarius is kind of the rebel of the zodiac. But I have to step back often and consider, am I doing this in an extreme way? So, as far as co-parenting, I have my beliefs about homeschooling, and I'm very set. So Aquarius is fixed. It's a fixed sign. And I'm very set on why I want to homeschool. Okay.
Right.
And when I was challenged, because I'm co-parenting with someone, I kind of reacted in a absolutely not, this is the plan. We've always wanted to do this. But, towards the end of the day, I thought about how the conversation went, and I just thought about, my son, and then I thought about my views, and I still lean towards homeschooling.
Right.
But I had to acknowledge that maybe at some level, I'm over doing that. And I rebel so much against the authority.
Right.
That I might be too extreme the other way. Maybe there is, because he was pushing, all the good things about public school. And I'm just like, no, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. I
Right.
homeschool. But then afterwards, I recognized that maybe I was harsh and I should have listened
Right.
more. But like, I'm allowed to have my opinion, but so is he.
Right.
Right. And Emerson has opinion. So he's a Leo stellium. He has a different way of viewing the world than me.
Right.
And so maybe at some point public school would be okay for him.
Right.
Where it was traumatizing for me. So, but I want him to be old enough to where he knows who he is. So that like when some kid tells them that's stupid, You
Right.
know, that he already is so comfortable with who he is as a person that that's not going to just totally shatter him.
Right.
You know, so I want him to grow into that.
That's somewhat of a good lead in, I guess you could say, with discussion on the balance and the not extreme. It's really easy to understand that you shouldn't be extremely dark.
Right.
But it's a little trickier to think about, well, extreme good, can balance out in that same way,
Right.
And the first example that comes to my mind, even though it's just from a movie or a cartoon, it's from The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Which Emerson is obsessed with right now.
Right, it's perfect. But you've got the main bad guy, Frollo, and he's this priest, who's heavily repressed. And just look at the awful things that he does from his repression. And
Right.
he's trying to do this extreme good. And you can take that into the real life where you have the Catholic priests that have, conflict or indiscretions with children or various things. They're trying so hard to be this good, and this repressed thing comes out. And sometimes it's really horrific.
Right.
When it pops out because we're not actually doing it. Or maybe you spend all your time off on mission trips or something, and you neglect your family, and
Right.
you neglect your children or something.
Right.
And so there's this extreme. And so just because you're doing good doesn't mean that it's balanced or it's right if you're not equally balancing on both sides. And so you have to be careful on the extreme for either side.
Right. Right. The Catholic Church is such a great example. I mean, there's so many examples, but I think what we've seen happen within the Catholic Church, well, really throughout its entire history, but what we're actually finally acknowledging
Right.
is that there is a big shadow there.
Yeah.
And that's a collective shadow.
Sure.
So I'm not saying that all the people that are Catholics on a personal level, are the same. However, at some point, what are we doing when we ignore
Right.
the shadow of the thing? So this is something that I'm always really nervous about affiliating myself with an organization. I don't want to call myself this. I don't want to call myself that, because guess what happens when I affiliate with a group? I now am ethically or morally obligated to look into the shadow of that group. And then it almost drives me crazy. So I actually just kind of choose to do my own thing and work on my own shadows, and I don't want it to get too complicated.
Right.
But
yeah.
I don't think the Catholic Church would like me if I was a member. They would just be like, please stop with the shadow work.
Now, we'll say, when we were discussing this earlier, you did point out that they do have a ritual to help because they've got
Right.
confession.
All religions have these rituals within them that actually is the rituals are beautiful.
To come let out your shadow.
But you can create your own. You actually don't have to do
Right.
any ritual that's ever been done before. It's not, the ritual of confession is no more powerful than you writing your thoughts out
Right.
at the end of the day. So
Right.
you give your power away.
Well,
at
and
that
then
point.
So that brings up the idea that they're using it kind of in a manipulative way, because they would have you believe that if you don't do it that way, then it's not going to work.
Right, and it is working for people, because it is, for some people,
Some people use it correctly.
might be the only time that they do shadow work.
Right.
And so for some
And
people,
they do it accurately. They do it the way they're
they
supposed
depend
to.
on it. So I had a friend, and her ex-husband was a devout Catholic, and he had all these affairs. He had slept with prostitutes and all these things, and she kind of laughed, and she was like, he was such a devout Catholic that he finally confessed it all to me, and then he felt better. And at some point it's like, okay.
Right.
But that there was this, he's like, I'm doing the shadow work, I'm paying out the shadow, so I'm morally and consciously fine now because I confess to it.
Right.
But at that point, is it really being whole? So the whole point in shadow work, right, is to integrate. And integrating the shadow is step one in the process of individuation. So yes, you can confess, but if you continue to do things after you realize that they hurt people or that they go against your own moral ethics, then you're not really doing any work.
Right.
You know, I don't even really know what that is.
Well, that's
It's like some kind of avoidance.
There's a difference there with that and ethics, and that I think is best described as someone like a samurai or someone who's trained in a deadly art, trained with a sword, and like they could kill you. They could kill anyone they wanted to, but they choose not to because they're a good person. And so they have the skills and they know what they're capable of. They know that they could kill someone. They know that they could hurt someone if they wanted to, but they don't. And that's an integrated shadow. And that's the way that we ultimately need to try to get ourselves to the point where I know that I'm capable of this. I know that I could harm you. I know that I am powerful, but I'm not doing that because I'm a good person. So just because you address your shadow doesn't mean that you're going off to do bad things. You're not like, okay, I'm going to do shadow work, so now I'm going to be a bad person for a week or something. It's acknowledging that you have that power and then using it to still do good things or still do what's right. That you have ethics, and there is a difference between the shadow and the ego and right and wrong, and then ethics. And you can certainly have an integrated shadow and still be a very ethical person.
Right. A lot of your ethics are formed based from your ego's observation of your reality.
True. Although I do think that there's probably a few things that are universally ethic.
Right.
Like
in
murder.
Every culture. Yeah.
And
that would be like the actual collective, not like this religion or this race or that race, but like the collective as a whole has a shadow, like the whole planet.
That is absolutely true. And so each organization and each religion and stuff sets up their own things that they consider right and wrong, and those little details start to become trivial.
Right. So I want to define what the word integration means because, it sounds really complicated. It's like, what does integrating it mean? And everyone talks about it.
Yeah.
But
it's just kind of abstract.
I'm going to read you the definition of integration, and then I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about it. So, simply put, integration is the action or process of combining two things in an effective way, two or more things in an effective way. So, we're not eliminating the shadow. We're not eliminating the ego. When we talk about integration, we're talking about bringing them together, okay, and creating harmony. And at some point with integration, as far as Jung is concerned, this is about loving and accepting all the parts of ourselves, okay? And this love helps us love others more too. So simply put, what is integrating? It's blending the ego with the shadow, merging them. So this would be like in the center, the transcendent function, right? This is how we transcend all of this, what's not the self.
Right.
Okay. The true self that, existed before you were born, that will continue to exist after, right? All of those, it's beyond that. So I'm not saying transcend it, like don't have your ego, you need the ego while you're alive.
Right.
But there are points where you can be so harmonious that you are like just fully embodying the self, which is like the spirit or the soul. Psyche is soul. So, and if I think about it, so another way to do shadow work, and this would be kind of like a big aspect for Jung, was the mandalas.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talked about this with the school, but the center of the mandala, which is like this, you have the circle or the cross within. Mm-hmm. Well, the point within all of that is the self. And so it's also interesting to think about, like in astrology, when you think of the sun, which is the self, and it's like this glyph, it's a circle with a point in the middle. Well, that point is the transcendent function, and that exists within every mandala. So when we make a mandala, we are pulling unconscious contents out and we're forming it in a way that is unifying, within that circle, within that cross. There's this unification process that's taking place, and it's actually making us whole on a very conscious level. And so what's the whole point of individuation is to become a whole person. It's for all of your aspects of your model of your psyche, which we talk about with Philip. All of that is now integrated in, and it works together.
Right.
It's not, none of it's cut off. You know, you can't cut off the life force for the shadow
Right.
and not expect something bad to happen. All right, so let's, I guess, share a little bit about how the shadow work has benefited our relationship with each other, our children, and our community as a whole. And some of the tools that we discovered along the way. Let's share a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, we've definitely done a lot of shadow work, and the journal that you talked about definitely helped get us going in the right direction. But I think once you start doing it, it becomes second nature, and then it starts happening everywhere, because you start asking yourself, well, why did this happen, and why are you reacting that way? And obviously, once you start seeing that there's deeper reasons for some things, then you understand there's deeper reasons for all of it, and you can start affecting things. And I think especially once you get a little bit of results and you start actually getting into some of the why and some of the deep reasons that you may react certain ways, you're able to start really peeling it back, and it becomes a much easier process. If you're a very angry person, and you start addressing that, then it becomes easier to see throughout each process. And so you certainly you help me look at things, and I think it helps to have a partner that does that, because they can see things
everybody
that you can't.
else sees your shadow before you do.
Right.
So I'm able to see your shadow, and you're able to see mine.
Right.
And it's easier, right? Because like I can see, oh my gosh, she's projecting. But it's really cool because so we've been working on integrating our shadow. The work's never done. Okay, it's a conscious choice that we actively engage in. And so anytime we start to lose our temper or get frustrated, we work together, right? And we have found some really cool ways of grounding each other. So, Robert Johnson also talks about the most powerful thing is when two shadows communicate with each other, and we've totally done this. But the key, I think, for us doing it together is to remain open, grounded, and operating, from love. And I think that love helps us, because when you study the shadow, it almost seems like you're being critiquing. So this is why astrology is so cool, because it's not like someone's telling you, that you're hypercritical. It's I'm sorry, you just have that potential in your chart.
Right.
So it's you can kind of tell that to someone and pull back, and they don't say, oh, are you criticizing me?
Right.
So I think if you're operating from love, that you're able to recognize it. I'm not you don't need to be this way.
Right.
It's you might need some space. I might light an incense. I might, for me, when I have my stuff, because I do have anxiety and all this stuff, and it does come from shadow stuff, I'm sure, and there is some trauma, and all that has fueled some of that. And so it's you can tell when I'm about to hit this anxious part of my day or my story or whatever, and then you'll bring me my TLC tea, which is tender loving care tea that my herbalist makes. And she also makes me a light formula. And when she made it for me, she was like, this drives out all the darkness. And so this is a ritual. Okay. And when I drink the tea, I feel like I'm able to process the darker feelings in a very grounded way. And crystals are also really great for this. There's many crystals that help us ground. I'm trying to think of some of the other things. Mantras, really help when you've done the shadow work, and now you kind of want to, create a different vibration, right? To sort of change it up after you did it, so after you process, you go through a big thing, you might want to just jump in water. You might want to just rub mud all over you. You might want to burn some stuff, and this is part of the ritual. And I thought it was interesting when he was talking about how throughout all of time, sacrifice and salvation have always kind of went hand in hand, but that the shadow doesn't have to be literal.
Right.
And so we can make these sacrifices, right? And this helps save us in some way, or what it's really doing is uniting us. And so, we do regular rituals where we write what we want to release down. And we're not trying, when we burn them, we're not actually trying to eliminate it. So I write them down on a piece of paper. I fold it up. I draw an alchemical symbol for transmutation on the top of the paper before I burn it. So I'm not actually trying, so let's go back to jealousy. I'm not trying to completely pretend like I'm never going to have that sensation, but now I want to transmute jealousy into something else.
Right.
Right. Which would be like, I wouldn't have to be so jealous if I was loving myself. Right. So I might turn jealousy into self-love and love for others. So that might be how I transmute it. So it could be different. But at the end of the day, when we do shadow work, we are doing alchemy, and it's sacred and it's important. And there's just indefinite ways.
Right.
The key is just to create some space for it. It doesn't have to be hours every day. I mean, good Lord, you still have to live. It's like before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water.
Right.
After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. So it's not like you can just sit around and ruminate on your shadow. It's not about that. It's like the whole reason you're doing it, you show it love, and then you can move on and you could actually live.
Right. You can write something. You could write poetry or a song or just free form make it art. Yeah. Listen to angry music or sad music or something and sing along and let it out,
Right.
And then like the example that Robert gave, he had a friend that was a chef, and he made a really nice fancy meal and took it out and threw it in the ocean and sacrificed it. And so instead of taking a young virgin or taking the best goat or calf in the town out and sacrificing that, he took, his beautiful meal that he worked hard on and sacrificed it. And it's the act of destroying something,
Right.
Helped as a ritual to that. And that satisfied the shadow side of him
Right.
after he had done something good.
And so that story is coming from when he's talking about why would you need to do that? It's because every time we do a really great thing and we go all the way to the right and we're like saintly. So like maybe we like donated a big chunk of money to some charity organization. That would be maybe when we would want to make the meal and sacrifice it. Because when we do these really just things, okay, it kind of fuels our ego. Okay. So we become like, I'm such a good person, and then it kind of loses the original intent, which might be to help people. Right. And then it's like, I need to be recognized. Right. So I feel like doing something like burning it or transmuting it at the end. So this is what keeps the teeter-totter in balance. And so like he was talking about like these saints, like when I see a nun or a saint, like I would assume if they're not doing shadow work that they've got a pretty big shadow because they're putting all of their focus on the right side.
Right. And
denying the other side. So I think about like a lot of these saints were writers, and I just read a whole book on like Ficino, and he's like I think he was like a bishop or something, but he would write some of the nitty gritty stuff about his self-down, and he was very much into astrology and stuff. So I think in that way he recognized that if you don't embrace it, you're kind of being naive. Right. But I think, if you're a monk or you're a really beautiful person and all you do is great things, it's even more important that you do shadow work.
Right.
Right? It's because you're so good, that it makes you feel as though you're disconnected from the shadow. And then that is not a harmonious, energy, and that becomes almost an ego trap.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying that people can't be good, but I'm saying that you have to reconcile these opposites and realize that one cannot and will not exist without the other. It's impossible to separate them. They are lovers,
That's
and
where
they are operating, they're mirroring,
right.
so it's like there's this tension, but they're also, they are one.
Right.
So, yeah, and that way it's so important. And I'm trying to think if there's anything. Oh, so for like with our children, I mean, not only am I more sympathetic when I catch them, they might be yelling or projecting, and I'm like, oh, they're projecting. So this is an opportunity for us to work with them. And so it makes me a little less like responding when they're having a breakdown. And I might be like, okay, let's make some art. Like with Iris, like she's 2. And when she's having a really bad time, and it's like I can tell that she can't reset, I'll be like, you want to watercolor with me? And she'll say, yes. And then she'll go and make a big mess. Mm-hmm. But she's better.
Right.
And so at that point, that's almost like her ritual, like her mandala. So I recognize that she needs an outlet. For Emerson, it's different. It might be like, go outside and run around, and get your sword out and just play Zelda, pretend like you're a warrior. That's more of a Leo thing anyways, I think. Just fully embrace that king and then come back, and then we can all, exist peacefully. And then also not projecting onto my kids when I'm having a bad day and they're being loud. Okay, that might trigger me, but because with the shadow work, I'm actually aware of how it's, their loudness is all the time. But for whatever reason in that moment, it's really bothering me. And in that moment, it's not them, it's me.
Right.
And so I have to do my own self-care, right? Instead of yelling at them to be quiet, what do I really need in that moment? I need to create quiet, sacred space for myself. So I might go hide in the bathroom for 5 minutes.
Right.
I might put on my headphones and be like, where I can see them, make sure they're safe, but I might be listening to binaural beats because I recognize that their loudness is just showing me, deep down, I need silence right now.
Right.
And I'm not honoring that. And so I have to be able to create it for myself. So that's some self-love.
And it's important to go ahead and start teaching the kids these things.
Yes.
So that when they get upset or when they have a big emotion come out, we don't shame them or make them feel guilty or make them feel like that was wrong or something, because that in turn just fuels their shadow later.
Right.
And so we have this opportunity now to help them start to integrate it earlier.
Right. And to sort of talk about right and wrong, I want to say like objectively, but that to give them these other examples that it's not all right and it's not all wrong. It's not all good. It's not all bad. Mm-hmm. So like maybe we wouldn't do this particular thing in public.
Right.
But I'm not saying that you doing it is shameful.
You're not a bad person because you did it.
Let them know that you're teaching them so that they can, to some extent, fit into society because you need to. You don't want your kid to be so wild and just like peeing in people's plants and that people look at them in a negative way, and then now that's how they feel about themselves. So it's important to say, we don't do that.
Right.
Because, the public deems that, like, we don't just pee... in public places. That's something you have to teach boys. And I'm not trying to shame him, right? So I'm like, this is totally okay. Mm-hmm. This is like actually kind of a taboo thing, but society deems it unacceptable.
Right.
So that way he doesn't, he understands it and it doesn't become a shadow thing. It's just like, well, I'm not going to pee in public, right? I'm not ashamed of my desire to pee in public.
Right. I was going to say on that same thought, but it's not on peeing in public, so I can't really say that.
That's just, where I went.
But like one of the things that I'm personally working on is a shame. And it caused me throughout my life in lots of different areas to be real private and secretive and to not share much about who I am or what I'm feeling or my desires or anything like that with anyone. And whether that came from rejection or shame or guilt or scolding or whatever it may be, there's any of that all plays together. It slowly over time caused me to just repress all of that, or to hide it and to not let it be seen. And that was my persona. I didn't want to keep feeling like people thought I was this way or that way. And so to protect myself, then you feel like that you hide it.
Right.
Or something, and then it comes out in all of these other ways, and you don't have control over that because it's your unconscious. And that's the whole point. And so if you're not letting it out, then you run that risk. And so by telling your kids, oh, that's shameful, or don't do that, or you shouldn't be that way or something, and they start hiding it, and maybe that's just the way they are. They like that, and
now they start hiding.
Now they hide it, and
other aspects of themselves.
And they think, well, I can't be myself here, so maybe I'm not a likable person, or maybe that this part of me makes me ugly or makes me stupid. And so I don't want people to think of me that way. So I'm not going to act this way, or I'm not going to tell someone when I feel this way.
Right.
And all of then that grows, and they get older, and it gets worse and more embedded. And then it starts really coming out and hurting people here and there. And so it's our job to at least in the home life, to not be that way, and to show them that even if they feel that way, they can channel it into something else. Like I've been thinking, if him gets mad playing video games, like maybe we get him to do an exercise, do some jumping jacks, or do some push-ups or something, and better himself, and channel that frustration into something beneficial. Or there's lots of different examples, but that's just one way that me personally, that I've been working on addressing my shadow and discovering ways that it keeps itself inside, and how it's hidden from a lot of different shame or guilt from when I was younger.
Right, and it needs attention.
Attention.
Here's another example of astrology helping us, and specifically you.
Mm-hmm.
And so, your Mars is in the 12th house.
Mm-hmm.
And the 12th house is one of the more complicated houses to understand, and it's hidden, it's unconscious.
Right.
So there are a lot of the shadows and stuff like that kind of reside in that house. So this was our ritual. We made a sigil, me and you, or I made it for you, and I put it on the fridge, and it's the Mars symbol, and you also have Vesta like right there. And so I combined the Mars and Vesta glyph, and I also, the colors I chose based on the fact that that's like a watery house, but it's in an earth sign. So I added the symbols for earth and water. And so I kind of put a lot of thought into it, but try to keep it as simple as possible and put it on the fridge. So now every time you see it, it reminds you of what is hidden.
Right.
But what is there. And so that was our little ritual for that. But what happens when you do the work? Well, Emerson also has Mars in the 12th house. So when you actively acknowledge and give your Mars direction, you are teaching Emerson, the next generation, how to do that properly as well. So it's so important that we are like a model, right, for good mental health for our kids, for living these whole lives, for, finding the spiritual and the beauty within life, and, just loving ourselves and being nice to ourselves.
Right.
During this, because shadow work is messy. It's, like I said in the beginning, it's not easy.
Right.
But, if you think about like a whole bunch of threads, okay, I embroider, so I'm a textile artist, and there's a lot of tangles, right?
Right.
So I would think about if I had 17 different colors of thread and I mixed them in a bag and shook them up. When I first start untangling it, it's going to seem so daunting. It's going to be like, this is impossible. But maybe after I start pulling out like 3 or 4 of the colors and eliminating those threads, it becomes a little bit more manageable, right? So all of the little bits of shadow work that we do kind of make it a little bit easier, and it's like you almost get used to it in that way,
right,
of as soon as that sensation comes up, you're working on it. And so you're not repressing it. So the shadows that we're working on mostly are the things that we had already repressed.
Right.
And so we're still pulling that stuff up, but the day-to-day stuff is kind of being taken care of as it happens.
Yeah.
And it's not being shoved under the bed or the closet or whatever your analogy would be. And so, yes, you still might have some things from your childhood to work through. And I don't know if that ever stops. For me, it's really hard. Like, I have like weird things that interconnect all the time. I'm like, holy crap. I didn't realize that was a freaking thing,
Right.
That's been holding me back. So I work on it. But the beautiful thing about the shadow, and here's what's so golden about it, is so I might work on my fear of abandonment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I realize one day that, maybe this other fear just went away and I didn't even understand it.
Yeah.
And I realized, I'm just not afraid of that anymore. And it's because there was all of this stuff that was attached to that fear of abandonment.
Right.
And so when I worked on that, I actually freed myself from many other phobias or fears. Mm-hmm. And I didn't even realize it happened.
Right.
And this is like homeopathy, it's like you're working with this one energy, but it's treating the whole person. And so when I worked on, I'm thinking I'm working on like hormones, but then I realized, okay, the hormones are better, but I also have more mental clarity. I have these other things. And I'm like, this is because me as a person, the whole person was being treated. Right. So I can't heal this aspect and not heal this.
Right.
Okay. But it works the opposite way too. Like I think about like allopathic medicine, like you take a medicine to treat the liver and now it's affecting the heart or whatever. So that's also how the shadow works. Like you think, oh, well, I'll repress that down and it won't affect anything else. But because it's all interconnected, just having like that one thing that you're repressing is actually affecting you as a whole.
Well, that's one of the reasons that I would put under the column for why you should do this work.
Right.
Because one of the examples that I think we gave and then they've given is like going to a party and being kind of a pushover and somebody making fun of you or this and that. If you had your shadow properly integrated and you were fully aware of your power and you embodied it, by nature, that eliminates most of the possibility of somebody picking on you, period. So because you're more confident in your ability, you interact with the world differently. Therefore, when you walk into that party, you have a different air about you, and it's far less likely that somebody is going to pick on you when you're very much confident and embodying your full power.
Yeah, you're just not a target.
You're not a target because you're just more confident, and you can look at it. I love the
because
example.
You're going to be able to look at that person that's like making fun of your friend or whatever in the eyes.
Right.
And without blowing up, you can say, that is not nice.
Right. Stop.
Right?
You
Stop
can't
doing
keep
that.
doing that. You're not
right,
allowed.
I will leave if you continue to bash my friend.
Yeah, I don't have to take this. Like, you can stop now, or we can, I'll leave, or this can happen.
They don't even do it to you because they know that you're going to stand up for yourself.
Right. You're not a pushover anymore. And so, like, that's one of the biggest reasons is it brings you this power, and that's the whole point. You're not becoming a dark, evil person. You're becoming an empowered person, a person who is aware of who they are and the strengths that they have. I think so often we look at all these things as weaknesses, so we try to avoid it, but it's not. My favorite example is the martial arts. It's so much, it tells you exactly the way it should be. Like, you're capable of great things, and you could totally defend yourself. You could hurt somebody if you wanted to. And once you know that, you can walk down the street confidently, and nobody's going to bother you. And so it takes away a lot of that fear. And like I said it before, just because you can doesn't mean that you're going to go hurt somebody. You just acknowledge that you could. And everybody better be aware that I could hurt you. And if you have that attitude, then they're not going to cross you because they don't want to get hurt, like, good grief. And they can see that because it's coming out of you. But you're still doing good things and righteous things, and you're being a good person. But when we talk about shadow, I feel like that there's a lot of reasons to be hesitant at first. You're like, I don't want to admit that I'm a liar. I don't want to admit that I cheated. I don't want to admit that I could kill somebody. You don't want to see the Nazi in you or see the bad king in you. But when you do acknowledge it, then you can face it and balance your teeter-totter, and you can use that energy and push you forward to do the things that you want to do. You can create things, or you can be whoever you want to be without this fear.
And this is like truly embodying love. So
Right.
at some point, the shadow wants to say that these things outside of ourselves are so evil. Like Nazis are so evil.
Right.
And I'm not saying that they don't have terrible qualities, but we cannot fight hate with more hate.
Right. And
so at some point, you have to learn to love those people that are outside of yourself that are causing all this ruckus, and say, well, they just haven't done the work, and I'm going to love them, and I'm going to set the example, and I might fight them. I'm going to stand up for innocence.
Defend yourself.
But at some point, working on the projecting hate onto those people that you deem as evil.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, it does two things. One is it allows you to love yourself, because you understand that you're not this evil person. And two, it allows you to love everyone else because you realize that they're not this evil person. That they
have the potential as well.
Right.
They might just have not planted that seed yet.
More than likely, they're projecting something that's happened to them to you. And I know you say a lot that, if a lot of times people that accuse you of things are often guilty of it themselves.
Yeah.
And because they're projecting it.
Exactly. And so you don't take it so offensively now when somebody's, looking at you.
Yeah.
And saying, oh my gosh, you're so loud, you're so this or whatever. And you realize that, they're actually...
That's a part of them that they dislike, or that they...
I can still love them.
Right.
Even though they're sitting there critiquing me. Mm-hmm. And it's because I recognize it's not about me.
Right.
But I also realize maybe I am loud or whatever it is.
And the thing is if, your shadow rears up and you're like, what do you mean I'm too loud? Well, you use that. And I think a lot it's like, well, I'll show you and I'll be even better. Like I'm going to talk at this good moderate tempo. No one's ever going to say I'm too loud again.
That's so funny.
And so you're using that's the example of how you get the energy out of it.
That's kind of where in some way the podcast probably came from, is so many people tried to silence me anytime I would talk about anything that mattered to me, and they'd be like, well, you're really stupid, you're unscientific, head in the clouds, and they so I wouldn't be able to even speak in like my own group of friends, because there would be these gatekeepers that would say, no, you're not allowed to talk about that,
right?
Where's your sources? And so what did I do? And what probably drove them crazy is like I created a whole podcast where I get to talk about whatever I want to.
Right.
And there are actually quite a few people out there that can relate to me, and it's so funny. And maybe I utilized the energy of people telling me to shut up over the years.
Right.
And rolling their eyes at me and said, well, you don't have to listen, but that doesn't mean I'm going to stop talking.
And think about how much more motivating that was than going about it from the ego.
Right.
Where if you were like, I'm going to make a podcast and everyone's going to love me.
And I'm going to talk about how much I hate these people that judged me.
Right. And everyone's going to think that I'm this way and it's going to be great. And I just don't feel like you would keep that motivation as long.
Right.
Because the other way has so much more energy potential, which is wild to think about. And I think at one point he even pointed out, he's like, we've exhausted our energy from the ego. Like all of the best ways to get energy from somebody stroking your ego.
Right.
You've done that. You do it every day, all the time.
Because it's conscious. So it's very easy. It's right there at the surface.
I'm going to do this and they're going to think I'm cute, or I'm going to do this and they're going to notice I'm strong, or like all of this. But there's so much more energy potential that we haven't even tapped into by utilizing the shadow.
Right.
And so that's been a super fascinating point through all of this.
For sure. So I'm going to end with another reading from this young book that is sort of just, his view on maybe like, why is this so important?
Okay.
Right. So, and then, we'll talk for a second. But anyways, It is often tragic to see how blatantly a man bungles his own life and the lives of others, yet remains totally incapable of seeing how much the whole tragedy originates in himself, and how he continually feeds it and keeps it going. Not consciously, of course, for consciously he is engaged in bewailing and cursing a faithless world that recedes further and further into the distance. Rather, it is an unconscious factor which spins the illusions that veil his world, and what is being spun is a cocoon which in the end will completely envelop him. This work is important because if you're not consciously working with it, it's still working with you.
Right.
Okay, so, it's...
And that personally, I was going to say frustrates me, but that feels like a shadow. But I don't want to just be a victim to this, this power that will cause this unconscious to do these things. I'd like to feel more in control of my emotions and my destiny, my power. So that's the more that I learn about doing this, the better it is.
Awesome. All right. If you all like this episode, we have a previous one that covers the whole model of the psyche with Philip Cliff. So we talked about the shadow. That's just one aspect of the greater model. We also go way deeper into Jungian concepts in our Life as a Guru program that you can join on Mighty Networks. You can literally search Life as Guru. And this is a program me and Philip work on. We teach it locally, but we also record it. And then in our Life as Guru, the whole community sort of communicates and talks. But so far, every class we've done has had one aspect of the model of the psyche.
That's what I'm saying.
Intertwined in it, because you can't really avoid
such
it.
a big, and I think that it's the critical point of our evolution. I think why it's so big, and when you go back and study all these different levels of evolution in humans, and whether that's through astrological means or mythology or dimensions or any of it, I think that understanding our psyche now is the way that we push forward and evolve again. And I guess that's why it's so important and embedded in all of this other mystery teachings.
Right.
Because that's how you do it. But you integrate your shadow, you go into your heart, you balance it, and you find that heart center that radiates love out, and it shoots you into the fifth dimension,
Which is love.
Which is love, yeah, and it's pure love, and then and that also transcends the duality, because you shoot across the third and fourth dimensions.
Right, because polarity
exists.
doesn't exist in the fifth dimension.
So by finding that balance, that's where you head towards the enlightened stage.
That's good. That's good. All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in. Check us out next time on the Astral Hour.